p.m. at the Rainier Beach Pool. And dinner will be provided for all attendees who come in person. Wednesday, May 17th, 12:30 to 2:30 p.m. at the Capitol Hill Library or online via Zoom is the Elder Renter Council meeting. Snacks and beverages will be provided for all in-person attendees. Saturday, May 20th, from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m., it's the RAP Regional Summit. Do you live in affordable housing? Have you been impacted or have concerns about the rising rents? Have you experienced housing injustice in Washington? Or are you a nonprofit staff person who works with residents? This one-day movement building event is for you. The Resident Action Project, also known as RAP, organizes with tenants in affordable housing communities, people who've experienced homelessness, and other people struggling to keep a roof over their heads. We're changing policy statewide, and when we come together, we can win. This in-person event will be hosted in 3 locations: Spokane, Vancouver, and South King County, specific locations to be determined. The agenda will include a dive into why resident organizing is crucial for housing justice on the local and state level, rent stabilization, where we are and where we can go if we build our movement, developing a roadmap to housing justice, and training and telling your story, organizing with your neighbors, using art and culture in the housing movement, and more. Lunch and snacks will be provided. Registration for this free event is open until May 12th. I will be there, so you'll have someone you know to sit with if you're kind of nervous about it. And then finally, Wednesday, May 24th, 6 to 8 p.m. is B Seattle's May Building Tenant Power Workshop. That's going to focus on how the legal system can affect your ability to find housing, your rights when looking for housing, and what changes to the laws may be coming down the lane. Okay, lots of stuff going on. So I would like to introduce our first speaker, Ty Reed. Ty is a community organizer in Seattle focused on homelessness advocacy and direct aid to encampments. She's also the operations director at Real Change and the co-chair of House Our Neighbors, a member of the Seattle Transit Riders Union and a B Seattle board member. Ty is going to start our workshop with some history about tenant displacement and gentrification. Take it away, Ty.
Sweet. Thanks for breaking out that old ass photo. Howdy, everybody. Like Kate said, I'm going to talk about a history of displacement in Seattle, kind of stuff I've learned mostly through my own experience and some time in school. I went to UW. And so I want to give some caveats. What I'm saying is, like, one, I've only lived in Seattle like almost 8 years. So there's that. I'm sure people have more history. 2, displacement looks like a lot of different things. So I'm just going to focus on the ones that I think are really relevant to Seattle right now and what we're seeing in the current like housing atmosphere. 3, oh yeah, I guess I'm not an expert is the 3rd one. So yeah, definitely put your opinions and stuff in the chat. I won't be able to look at it or engage until afterwards, but questions, follow-up, context, all of that's good. So begins my overview of displacement in Seattle. I will start by kind of rooting us in the definition. I think that because displacement happens in various ways, like I described, there's a few different ways that kind of researchers or studiers talk about it. There's kind of direct displacement when residents are kind of forced to move because of rent increases or because of building renovations, right? You just get priced out of the city. Or exclusionary displacement, it's when housing choices for low-income people are just so limited that there's only so many places they can go. And then there's also displacement pressures, which is when supports and services that low-income families rely on, they totally disappear from the neighborhood, and so they're not able to stay there. Displacement, for people who talk about it often, for folks in the housing and homelessness scene in Seattle, but all across the globe, right? They describe it, and we describe it as a form of violence. So we do want to understand it in that way that disrupts many aspects of people's lives. and the social fabric of the city and our society as a whole. And there are profound material, psychological, and social consequences. So when we talk about displacement, we aren't just talking about not getting to stay in the neighborhood that you like, or having an opportunity to move across the country or something. We're talking about a violent form of involuntary movement that the state, in cahoots with, capitalism, corporations, enforces on poor and working class people. Oh, and I guess I should mention that, yes, my name is Ty Reed. I use she, her pronouns. For this, I did not put the long list of things that Kate said. I just put I'm the co-chair of House Our Neighbors. And this is displacement in Seattle and also King County, because I think the county as a whole is going to be a large part of the displacement story, because people, specifically Black and Brown people, have been pushed out of the city. So the first way that we can understand displacement is through redlining. And the definition of redlining, I'll just read it straight up. Redlining can be defined as a discriminatory practice that consists of the systemic denial of services such as mortgages, insurance loans, and other financial services to residents of certain areas based on their race or ethnicity. I'm sure most of us are pretty familiar with redlining. We've seen this redlining map, or I've seen it dozens of times just being in Seattle. We can always overlay the voting maps when there's a progressive and a corporatist at any level of any Seattle seat, that you can pretty much overlay it with this map, and it aligns pretty well. So as I'll show and demonstrate throughout this kind of conversation, is that this redlining map, the origins of legalized segregation in Seattle as it was being settled, still affects us today, and we can see those remnants just in the city that exists today. So the reality of the definition I just gave you, which is a little bit generic and standard, meant that banks would not loan money to Black and Brown people to purchase or fix up their homes in neighborhoods, because it was seen as declining, right? Redlining pushed home prices down. And this enabled a lot of, as negative as that connotation is, the reason we have neighborhoods like the Central District today is because those prices being pushed down and depressed allowed Black families to purchase homes, even though they didn't have assistance from banks. Later, as Seattle ran out of room, as we'll talk about later, the banks that finances their purchases, they were drawn to the central area for its affordability. And, we get gentrification from that. In Seattle's history in the early 1900s, we see segregation being first imposed on Asian Americans, who for a long time and still today, most of Seattle's history have outnumbered Black folks in Seattle. Chinese people specifically were confined to Chinatown, and Japanese people in Japantown before the communities were destroyed and its residents forced to flee in the early 1800s. So that's kind of where we have the Chinatowns we have today. In the 1940s, William Gross's legacy really affected the way that the Central District was able to be created, right? You have this guy who is kind of a successful Black man, the wealthiest Black man in Seattle. And his wife was one of the first Black people in Seattle, first Black women, able to get a lot of success and actually buy land in this poor neighborhood, the Central District. And so then after he had bought a lot of different plots, he was selling them to other Black successful people. So they were able to congregate in the Madison Valley. And that's where we get the Central District today. Post-war Seattle looked very different. The rules of segregation were still limiting Black people, Asian people, and Jews specifically by enforcing deed restrictions, racial restrictive covenants that are just outright, none of these people are allowed to be here, and by the compounding systems of discrimination already being organized by the real estate industry. And I should add, this is also just straight up white neighbors. It wasn't always just industries, just white people kind of getting together to ensure that Black people, Asian people, and Jewish people could not live in their neighborhoods. And then because of that, that's where we saw the Central District really start to be formed and start to be solidified as a Black neighborhood. After Japanese internment, where a lot of Japanese folks were, ripped from their homes, forced to sell their property and their businesses for dirt cheap. Many of those places were occupied by the growing population of Black Americans during the post-war war, after all of there was all this work to be done, right? So we see the ways that Japanese internment actually enabled the Central District to even allow even more Black folks to be there. In the 1960s, discrimination based on race was still fully legal, and we see these really defined neighborhoods where it's Black and Asian people, Native Americans, all being in their specific silos in the Central District, in China and Japantown. Small pockets of residents remained in High Point housing down in the South End, which is why we still see Black people, Black families down there to this day. But the number of Black folks living in Soto and Georgetown during that area declined overall as the population of housing gave way to freeways and warehouses and industrial sites, which is kind of the Soto and Georgetown that we're familiar with today. I cannot. Okay, and then in 1968, that's where we see the change where Congress passes bans not allowing these racial covenants, these racial discrimination in housing. The idea that hopefully it would end redlining, we know that functionally that never happened. Seattle City Council even enacted specific local laws that would do the similar things just to like kind of double down on that. And because of that, Black Americans and Asian Americans, specifically Japanese and Chinese, were spread even south from the CD after more places allowed them. So we see this idea that like the ending of anti-discrimination laws in general causes displacement. Even though for some people that was a lot of opportunity, but other people, this was just the inability to stay in those neighborhoods any long. But we can see even in the 1960s, and we see it today, most of North Seattle, West Seattle, the East Side, which is, Bellevue, those areas are still overwhelmingly white and still very much racially restricted. This is just kind of the South and the Central area changing. And then in the 80s, we see the gentrification begin, which is something a lot of folks, if you lived in Seattle for any amount of time, I've only lived here 7 years and I've seen it happen. Starting in the 80s, the population of King County was 88% white, which is really shocking because in the 50s, just in the 50s, 3 decades prior, it was 96% white. And we begin to see gentrification as the north of the Ship Canal still remains virtually all white, West Seattle, the East Side, and then south of that is where mostly Black and brown people are. And we see the beginning tales of how gentrification comes to happen. The definition of gentrification, another one I just like to root ourselves in at least the words that people mean when they use these phrases, is a profit-driven race and class change of a historically disinvested neighborhood. Disinvested in this context means that businesses and governments were abandoned, where there was little to no new development or maintenance of existing buildings that would have enabled these neighborhoods to actually flourish until an inflection of money or wealthy interests. Gentrification often occurs where land is cheap and the chance to make a profit is high due to wealthy people finding interest in these places, and we see that happening. In 1990, there were nearly 3 times as many Black people as residents in that area, but just by 2000, the number of white residents had surpassed the number of Black folks living in that neighborhood, the Central District, for the first time in 30 years. So that's where we see the beginning shift. I know people probably didn't see the visible shifts of gentrification the way that we see it with all of these buildings that people like to demonize about looking new and out of place and being signs of gentrification. But in reality, this was already underway in the 90s, which a lot of people I'm sure who have been here recognize that. The overall racial shift in the Central District is clearly in favor of new white in-movers, and then a lot of Black folks are moving out for various reasons. During this time, the incomes for people who make $50,000 or more has substantially risen. And that's important because that's in 2000. So don't think $50,000 today, think $50,000 in 1990 or in 2000. So already in that time period, it has substantially risen. Most Black families in the CD at that time are making less than $15,000. And so you can see already the shift happening. These low-income families comprised a smaller percentage of total households in 2000 than in 1990. So meaning that not only are Black people making substantially less than the people who are now in their neighborhoods, there are fewer of those Black folks living in the neighborhood 10 years later. By 2000, most of the area's residents that were 22 to 39, the kind of like income bringing in age were white or Asian, and Black folks in comparison were mostly either under 22 or over 60. And these percentages suggest that there are just fewer Black people in the district in prime incoming years, making it more likely they are not going to be able to buy houses in this neighborhood, and more likely that they will lose their home in that neighborhood. Additionally, which I think we should always like talk about a lot, I know someone pointed out on Twitter that very few people are running for a school board. One of the things that was directly impacted by the gentrification of the Central District is the schools. The presence of better educated white and Asian American residents. It has increased the education gap between Black and white children and adults. I know that Garfield is still kind of referred to as a what do they call it, a slave ship, because of that really distinct class and race difference in those schools. And so even in the 90s and 2000s, we see that happening, and we see it today. Increasingly in the Central District, for Black people at least, it's a community of the very old, or the very young, with many better educated Black folks moving southeast to Seattle's Rainier Valley or into Renton or other suburbs. Basically, if you could afford, if you're a working class Black person at this point in the Central District, you could decide to stay there in a neighborhood that really wasn't yours anymore, that you really couldn't afford to live in, or you could go to South Seattle or South King County, which a lot of working class Black folks have done. Gentrification has many faces and many parts. I think the most harm that can be done when talking about gentrification is talking about it as like one policy, or just like white people having a decision to just move into a neighborhood. That is like way too simple. There are many ways that that gentrification plays out over a period of time. There are federal, state, and local policies that either enable or encourage this kind of social phenomenon. And ironically, like I mentioned before, anti-housing discrimination legislation encouraged this movement, right? In the 70s, Washington passed 2 different anti-discrimination statutes, the Mortgage Disclosure Act and the Fairness in Lending Act. And while this enabled Black folks to move more freely, it meant that that neighborhood was even more open to gentrification once folks started to flee into the suburbs in the 60s and the 80s. At the same time, white Americans, concerned, being juxtaposed with their parents, who had this kind of suburban white picket fence lifestyle, and were, just now becoming concerned against rising gas prices. The urban lifestyle seemed more attractive, and we see more white people moving into the Central District in the 80s, which made, and they were even more attracted to the depressed housing prices, right? We have a lot of cheap housing, and a lot of folks who want to do the opposite of what their parents did, move back into the cities. And I will say, ironically, white people are now moving back into rural areas and doing the whole like commune living outdoors thing. So it's kind of like an every other generation type of thing. They began to, that's where they began to take over the Central District. So we see that just the things like gas prices or the invention of cars, which is why cities on the Western coast are more spread out, because they came about as we began to become obsessed with car culture. Things like that also drive up displacement. A 2003 study of discrimination in mortgage, home mortgage lending. So this is after redlining has allegedly been made illegal. The Association of Community Organizations for Reform discovered that Seattle's Black population's Black loan applicants were still 2.56 times more likely to be denied a loan than white applicants in 2002. So clearly, redlining, despite all of the laws, it still exists and is still part of the contributing factor when we think of gentrification. Not only that, but gentrification has increased home values, which for people who can afford it, though they may complain about it, also increases property taxes, which are inherently regressive. So even though it might seem like a great thing to have a house that owns $1 million, that is $1 million, if you can pay the property tax for that home because it's based off of value, then you might complain, but you always live there. Other people, no matter how attractive living in a neighborhood is, it's just not worth that price. And we saw during the times of the beginnings of gentrification that some Black residents were seeing property taxes higher than their mortgage payment even. So definitely not worth staying there. The rapid change in culture also pushes people out. Even if you can afford to stay in one of these neighborhoods, like I said before, there's less incentive to stay in a place that feels less and less like home. So I have so much written about exclusionary zoning. Exclusionary zoning, and this is a graph of a majority of Seattle's housing growth, which I'll talk about a little bit. In the last 10 to now, we're talking like 2010s, 2020, has been in the central area. So things like exclusionary zoning, which I will define, have directly led to where we even build housing, let alone where people could choose to live. So the definition that I've pulled for exclusionary zoning is kind of an act when government restricts what a person can do with property, right? That's pretty much it. What you can do with your property, your piece of land that you bought, is kind of exclusionary zoning, to be super general. Those things are inherently bad, right? We don't want, like, I don't know, sewage right next to like a school or something. Those kinds of things make sense, but in actuality and practice, what we've seen is exclusionary zoning being used by communities to cordon off entire sections of cities from dense housing and enshrine this kind of American ideal of that white picket fence or that, that single family home into law. Researchers assert, because I was reading this paper about this, there's a lot to it, that zoning actually acts as kind of a tax that artificially increases the price of housing due to manufactured scarcity. That is, when there is an unmet demand and it continues to grow and prices are up, the share of a house's cost that is simply the cause of scarcity increases. So there's all of this artificial scarcity and this artificial inflation to the cost of houses. Like I've told you, there are houses in the CD that used to be like $1,000 and now are $1 million. That actually increases the prices of taxes for folks. And like I said before about taxes. This is kind of stuff that's general, the whole entire country. But apparently the exception of Texas, who kind of has loose restrictions, this is why it's a sprawling place, has those kinds of laws. Exclusionary zoning is not specific to Seattle. But like I said before, it especially is a problem here, and you'll see in like LA and San Francisco, because we reserve a lot of our land and a lot of our density is reserved for low density single family housing. Sorry. A lot of our spaces are reserved for low density housing. And that, like I said, is because of being built out during the automobile age. We're just inherently going to be built out because of that. And from 2010 to 2020, half of the city's housing growth was in the central district. As you can see, that's where this graph relates to. The blue side is, I wish I could read that. Oh, it's right here. Housing units, and this is the population, right? Kind of to show that even though the numbers look like they're closer, the population has totally outgrown how much housing we've built, and all of the housing we've built has only been in a couple of places. The north of Seattle, mostly along not the link builds, north of Seattle, mostly in areas like Lake City Way, by Northgate, and then central Seattle and Capitol Hill and the central district. These were areas that were previously undesirable, right? And so along with gentrification, exclusionary zoning has caused the displacement of Black and Brown and queer people as we continue to not build enough and across the entire spectrum of Seattle and only in a couple places. And even then, I would note that the numbers for how much we should build relative to the people who have come in here have not met up. And I would like to note, this is something I learned that was new to me, was that part of the reason why Seattle is seeing such a dramatic rise in homelessness and displacement and gentrification is because Washington itself is in the top 10 most regulated states when it comes to zoning, and Seattle is top 5 in the entire country when it comes to zoning. So we are so strict about where we build, even compared to the entire nation. And that's because about 65 to 75, so we'll say 65 to 75% of the city of Seattle is zoned specifically for single family homes, meaning you can't even put up a duplex, an apartment, a triplex, or any other kind of housing. It's just homes. And people have estimated that because of this, if 65% more of our land was actually allowed for multifamily housing, we could be developing 120,000 homes over that same time period, 2010 to 2020. That's how many we could have generated, which obviously would have aligned much more with the population growth that we saw. And then recent data that I was looking at suggested that housing costs exacerbated by exclusionary zoning are prohibiting access to and boosting segregation in public schools for all the reasons that I mentioned that were related to gentrification and redlining, right? Poor Black and Brown families are being pushed into South King County school system, which are reaching, according to the study, apartheid status, right? They are so deeply segregated that is reaching a concerning level of status. Though I would say since the 60s, it hasn't been great. These current zoning laws do not work for us and are not meant to accommodate all of the population growth that I've just talked about in the last 100 years, because these are 1973 regulations that just don't fit the city that we have today, right? I put transit-oriented development will be the death of us. I don't want people to take that very dramatically. That's mostly just for the opportunity for me to say that near transit, about a third of the land is for single-family homes, and yet only 5% of housing permits are located there, right? Compared to almost 90% in zones that allow apartments. Developers want to build when they're allowed to. And I know we're supposed to hate developers. I'm more like, the research shows that more housing helps poor people, so I can't not be for that. But even if, just based off of this idea of supply and demand, when developers have an opportunity to build, they want to build big housing, lots of apartments so that they can charge people rent. It is due to governmental policies that have forced them to only develop in the few neighborhoods that it's allowed, which is why it feels like we've just had so much construction. And then thirdly, I want to talk about legalized economic segregation. That is the end result of exclusionary zoning, right? We could talk about it in many different ways, but in reality, it's meant that our cities are still economically and therefore racially segregated. Regulations that restrict the production of new housing cap the number of people who can live in a desirable area. That's the reality of exclusionary zoning. And the wealthy people were always outbid poor people in the market of homes, and high prices and economic exclusion, of course, ensue because of that. Wealthy people will always be able to have a home, always have, no matter what the state of the home. Even if there's 10 homes in this city, we know that wealthy people will have them and poor people will be on the street. The heightened density limits that we've imposed on apartment buildings as well, so not just the exclusionary zoning of where you can build apartments, but it's also how many you can build and how high you can build them, can also cause exclusion if they, by their numbers, reduce the number of units you would have otherwise built, which we know to be true, right? If we can only build a sixplex in a neighborhood, that could have been a skyscraper, which could have been more apartments for people, more places for folks to live. In city where lots of people want to live, less new housing means more upward pressure on the prices, like I mentioned before. And one fewer housing unit being built means one fewer family that's able to live in a place with good access to opportunity. Directly linked income segregated neighborhoods creates enclaves where visible homelessness is more criminalized, right? We know that there are neighborhoods because of zoning, because of who lives in a neighborhood where you can have single family homes versus who lives in a neighborhood that's marked for industrial use, or it's downtown business, or it's apartments. We have created these enclaves where visible homelessness and poverty are more criminalized, and homeowners have a disproportionate amount of political power to use government resources to exclude poor and homeless people. Think about sweeps, right? There's no way that a tent could be set up in Ravenna, because as soon as it happens, and I've seen it happen in the parks there, people with power and people who have connections will always be able to call for the erasure and the removal and the displacement of folks who are poor. And the same study that I've been talking about in 2010, 2020, showed that displacement was more than twice as likely in a tract with little market rate construction than in census tracts with high levels of construction. So this is where I say the numbers just bear out. people move less when the neighborhood that they've been in has had a lot of construction. Construction is actually good for the city, despite what people will say, right? We want to be building more homes for folks. Construction of market rate housing, like I said, reduces housing costs for low-income families and consequently helps to mitigate displacement in many cases. I don't want my emphasis of market rate housing to say that we shouldn't have social housing, free housing for what we really need. But in reality, we shouldn't be stopping developers from building more. We should be stopping the government from giving them breaks for building more, because that's actually shitty. And we should be getting tax money if they are going to be building stuff. Research from 2015 in that time period suggested that in Seattle, even $100 increase in median rent caused a 15% increase in homelessness, which the point in time count for 2014, 2015 showed that there was a 22% increase in homelessness from one year to the next. So we're seeing that even every year that we see the rent increase, we are likely to see people become homeless. And in general in the city, before I move to the next one, income inequality is worsening, specifically because poor people who don't become homeless are spending more and more on housing and land. In general, our economy suffers when working class people or middle income people are spending 50% of their income on housing. I don't want that to suggest that I think we should be spending money on housing in general, but with the economy that we have, it's built on people spending stuff, and people can only spend it on rent and then bills and food. People are not doing anything to actually drive their economy. I want Kate to know, you could definitely say something if you want me to go faster or something. Just let me know.
Maybe just like a little teeny bit faster because it's almost 6:40, but this is really fascinating. So don't go too fast.
Okay, I'll give myself to 6:45 and I'm about to kill it. Okay, so the rent is too damn high, right? That's like the problem exists today. All of the factors that I just described kind of culminated in the rent increasing outrageously. Rents in Seattle increased 69% since 2010 till 2020, I think, or 22, and 155% since 98. So the average rent in Seattle in 2022, just in that year, increased by about 19%, according to a report from Apartment List. So that means that a rent for one bedrooms were about $1,681. I'm paying above average, and two bedrooms were at $2,000. Since so much of the city is rent burden, about 46%, our city's economy suffers, right? Increasingly, community members are being forced into homelessness, and high rents are directly one of those reasons. Now that the rents are allowed to increase, because there was kind of a period during COVID, very small period for some people, where there was no evictions and there were no rent increases. We've seen middle income people being pushed to more affordable neighborhoods, which used to be or is South Park. And now we're seeing folks in that neighborhood being displaced due to the beginning stages of gentrification, what people are calling the first markers of gentrification of South Park, which used to be the last neighborhood where working class or Black and brown working class people could buy a home. It is now becoming kind of an enclave for middle income renters who are being priced out of other parts of the city, like Capitol Hill. Rental assistance is inadequate. I know we'll talk about some programs, and you should use as many programs as that we have, but even during COVID, we saw that a large portion of the millions of dollars given to the state, given to the county by the state and the federal government, went to landlords who were still able to evict tenants, right? So a lot of that money kind of, I would say, was burnt up, and people still ended up on the streets. There are very few regulations that prevent rents from increasing. Rent control is currently illegal in Washington State, so there's just no end in sight. I mean, we'll talk about other regulations, like they'll talk about them later, but there are very few that actually exist, and the ones that do really only affect Seattle, which is clearly getting wider and wider. Rent at low-income housing properties is actually relatively affordable. So that is to say $1,100 might seem really cheap to the average person, but to someone who's living on TANF or SSI or disability, that is absolutely out of their range of affordability. And finally, evictions have been a source of displacement, right? When people are evicted, even if they don't end up on the streets, they are not in the same neighborhood as before. They're often not in the same zip code. I don't know why I can say that. And in the United States, unlawful detainers, which is the legal word for an eviction, provide a legal framework for which by which landlords can use the power of the state to reclaim possession of a rental unit and physically remove its occupants. Evictions often result from a tenant falling behind, but they can also be other violations of the lease terms, and then people are forced to move and be displaced. They've been associated with increased risk of job loss, higher rates of depression, homelessness, obviously, worse health outcomes, and higher stress levels. So evictions don't just displace people, but they have that violent effect that I was describing, where displacement actually harms people's bodies and minds. Their models done of property level turnover in the city of Seattle have actually revealed, and this is some of the most important stuff that I wanted to say, so I wanted to make sure I got to it because this is really new to me. People have shown where evictions are happening in the city, and then showing where there is planned demolition or remodeling. So this is where we're seeing directly a link to places that have a bunch of evictions all at one time, maybe by the property owner, maybe by multiple property owners, and now being prepped directly for gentrification. So it isn't just that this is happening in gentrification is some sort of natural occurrence. It is they are actively evicting people in specific neighborhoods in preparation for gentrification, taking advantage of those low home prices to attract wealthy white homeowners or businesses in order to change the culture of the neighborhood. And of course, all of this disproportionately targets Black residents, not simply due to lower incomes, but rather as it relates to the legacy of segregation that I've been talking about, which prevented so many households from purchasing homes and participating in the building of a middle class that other people were able to do. And so I will say there are a few things that freaked me out a little bit about tomorrow Seattle, because we don't really have an end in sight for any of those other things. There's environmental disaster. The Office of Emergency Management conducted a simulation of a quake, and it showed that that in a Seattle earthquake, how much was it? Black residents were twice as likely to be in a severely damaged block, and in a Cascadia wide, so it's like in the region, 81%, Black people were 81% more likely to be in a home that is damaged by the earthquake. So we're already seeing that disinvestments in Black neighborhoods and forcing Black people into poor maintained buildings is actually setting them up for displacement and death when the big earthquake inevitably comes. We already know the way that the government reacts to Black neighborhoods being razed or any kind of structural damage, like we saw in Katrina. Any minor damage to a neighborhood or buildings that were occupied by Black folks is way more likely to be destroyed and completely rebuilt. I would say the death of tech, but I don't think there's a huge thing to worry about. People only kind of talking about the death of tech, but the idea that this industry that has driven so much economic growth, if they are seeing a loss in labor with a lot of people being fired, but also a lot of people being hired in the industry, so overall it hasn't changed a lot, what that will mean for our economy and what it'll mean for all of the homes that we've built and the buildings that we've built specifically to meet the needs of that industry. And then just general urban sprawl with the land still with exclusionary zoning still in play. Low-income BIPOC residents are left confined to certain sections of the city, competing for limited affordable housing opportunities. And so they're likely to end up homeless or pushed into neighboring suburbs, which we're already seeing now as Black and brown folks are pushed out of Seattle into South King County. I have a last slide, but it's more about stuff I think people already know about. So it's just like all the good stuff happening. Things like tenant protections through the Stay Healthy Coalition, which Be Seattle is part of, through the social housing initiative that just passed. That's some hope. The Missing Middle Washington bill, though I know it has a lot of issues, could be another path forward for increasing our housing supply in neighborhoods currently zoned just for single family homes. And rent control as a fantasy that even if it happens in Seattle, still needs to change at the Washington level. I think it's something that worth fighting for, because people have shown that having rent control actually substantively improves people's lives and ability to stay in neighborhoods. So sorry for the long lecture. I hope it was informative. It is 6:45, so my timing is perfect. I will be in the chat if anybody has any questions.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much, Ty, for all of that history. That was amazing. Excuse me. I'm going to share my screen again so we can, if my computer likes me today. All right. So, tonight we're going to focus on the following types of displacement: rental increases, renovations or renovictions, rent or income restrictions being removed, and zoning changes. If you want more specific information strictly about eviction displacement, check out our YouTube channel and our Building Tenant Power workshop that's focused strictly on the eviction process. We're going to drop the link in the chat for that workshop if you want to watch it later. And then sorry, y'all, I'm working with two computers here today. So rental increases. With regards to rental increases, as of November 8th, 2021, a landlord must give you written notice of a minimum of 180 days prior to a housing cost increase. Housing costs include rent and any monthly fees you pay your landlord, like the storage fee, a pet fee, a parking fee. The notice must include specific language about how to contact the city for information about your renter rights. Notices that do not include this information cannot be enforced in Seattle. And we're going to drop in the chat that exact language. Increases can only begin at the start of a rental period unless you are month to month. For example, if your lease is for a year, they cannot give you a rent increase in the 2 months in because you're locked into a year lease. If you're month to month, your landlord can raise your rent without proper notice.
Tanya, we can see a little window that says exit full screen. Could you just, thank
There you
you.
go. Sorry about that. Notices of increase issued on or after July 1st of 2022 may trigger EDRA, the Economic Displacement Relocation Assistance. If the increase equals or exceeds 10% on its own or combined with other increases within the same 12-month period, qualified tenant households may receive financial aid to move. No increase can take effect if your rental unit does not meet the minimum housing code requirements under the Residential Rental Inspection Ordinance Program. And we're going to drop that link in the chat just so you can kind of see what that checklist looks like. If your rental increase equals or exceeds 10% on its own or combined with other increases, pet rent, storage fees, parking, the landlord must include information about EDRA. When you receive a notice regarding a rent increase or other possible displacements, such as renovations, income restrictions being changed, zoning changes, or you're living someplace that your landlord wasn't supposed to rent, there may be some programs available to help with relocation assistance. The first one we're going to talk about tonight is EDRA. EDRA is a very short acronym for a very long program. Economic Displacement Rental Assistance went into effect on July 1st of 2022. Now that it has been in effect for around 8 months, there is some data available to show that it's been successful in helping individuals move, although there have been issues with long wait times. We're placing an article in the chat that discusses the program, which includes some of the successes, some of the issues, and, how it might look going forward. With many of us experiencing sharp rent increases throughout the city over the last year, we want to mention how it provides relocation assistance. It provides relocation assistance to tenants who receive a housing cost increase of 10% or more by itself or combined that occurred within 12 months of the new notice taking effect, earn 80% of the area median income, and notify the landlord of their intent to move before the increase takes effect. So if you get notice of these things and you decide that you're going to move because of it, you have to notify the landlord before the increase is scheduled to take place. When tenants qualify for EDRA, landlords must pay up to 3 times the monthly cost. So these are what income eligible households look like. For right now, as you can see, a household size of 1, it's 80% of the household income maximum. And how you figure that out is you can Google AMI, how to figure that out. But here's a basic idea, is that you calculate your income, the number in your household, and then it'll tell you what your percentage is of AMI. And if you have more than 8 people in your household, Google is your best friend. There's a percentage calculator. All right, and SDCI has created a slideshow that goes into the details a bit more. We're going to drop that link into the chat. There's also an application portal for EDRA with forms and more information, and that'll go in the chat as well. When you receive a notice from your landlord about being displaced for any of the reasons we're discussing tonight, there are certain things that can give you time to figure out next steps, or to push back against it, or just give yourself a little breathing room. One of the things is making sure you have received all the legal information and paperwork required to be given to you with the notice. If you are not sure, please contact us. We're happy to walk you through, or check out SDCI's website. Now, I'm excited to introduce Carol, a renter in Seattle, who's going to speak about their experience with missing legal information and paperwork, and how that has affected them with regards to their rent increase.
Thank you so much.
Carol?
Thank you. Yes, I have information about exactly this. And I put a picture of a cat that is me whenever my landlord raises my rent. Okay, so let me tell you about my journey, about how I got my rent increase notices rescinded twice. And apologies, I'm keeping my camera off because I have a very exciting life. So I moved in September 2021 into my first apartment on my own. It is not a very nice place, and it's also not low income housing. So there's roaches in the halls and in the apartments. There's popcorn ceiling that cracks all the time. There's paint so thick that the door won't close. Laundry facilities are expensive and always out of order. And one day there was a roach on my computer as I was working from home. And one time a roach walked by while I was on the toilet. So this is not a fancy place. And it's $1,500 a month for a 1-bedroom. So 6 months after I moved in, I got a 6-month notice for my rent to go up exactly 9% at the 1-year mark. No information was included about the tenant rights or SDCI, and I had heard about the new law. And also this happened to coincide right about when I got laid off from my job. So I freaked out, but I looked up all the laws, I contacted people, I asked questions. And then because it was a 6-month notice, I waited 5 months, and then I contacted SDCI twice. First, I started with the renter hotline, but they didn't know what to do. So I went to the SDCI violation list and said, could you please review my rent increase notice? They did not include that language that was shown earlier in the slide about contacting to get information on your rights. So I had to contact them a couple times, but I got a very helpful person from SDCI who got my rent increase notice rescinded right away by calling my landlord. I think it took 2 or 3 days. This person was really on the ball. I tried to get everyone's rent increase rescinded in the whole apartment complex because I knew that no one had gotten their rights on the page. But I only succeeded with one neighbor because some people found the process intimidating and because SDCI said they couldn't rescind everybody's rent increase. Each person had to call individually, which was very frustrating because the majority of my apartment complex is Spanish speaking. And the person on the phone in Spanish was not very helpful. One of my neighbors. And one neighbor was subjected to frightening verbal abuse from the property manager and backed down when she called SDCI, and then SDCI called. So that is one reason why I only interact with my landlord over email. So everything is documented, and then I never have to be verbally abused. So around the 1 year point, I asked for a new lease and did not receive one. However, my rent still had not gone up, so it stayed at $1,500. Then they gave me a new 6 months increase notice of 9% if I signed a lease, or 22% if I went month to month. It lacked information about EDRA, which says that you must receive EDRA notice if your rent goes up more than 10%. And so the for SDCI was, does that month to month fee count? So I waited on the tips of my toes for 5 months. The answer is yes, that month to month fee does count. You should receive the EDRA notice. Yeah, so I called SDCI after 5 months. Another kind person helped me. I had to call a few times though. And he said that I would be the one testing out this new law with the language about the month to month fee of $200 per month. So that 22% increase. Meanwhile, the CEO of the property management company called me and I told him I was busy and needed to correspond only over email because I knew he would try to trick me into a higher rate. And I wanted everything in writing because I do not trust these folks. These are not your nice landlord. So he emailed me and I just forwarded the email to the agent from SDCI. The SDCI called the CEO and spoke to him. And then the CEO emailed me saying he and his lawyer refused to rescind the increase. So I just forward that email right to SDCI because that is illegal. That's not correct and that's not appropriate. So SDCI agent again spoke to the CEO for a long time. Then the CEO offered me an increase of only 9%. Waiving the $200 month-to-month fee, so therefore making it below 10%. And he said, regardless of the law, I would still need to have my rent increased by 9%. And he was trying to trick me. And so I did not accept. So I forwarded that email to SDCI. I'm just always forwarding everything to SDCI because they're the enforcement arm. They actually have power. And so then I finally got my second rent increase notice rescinded. They didn't even send it to me. They just sent it to SDCI and SDCI sent it to me because they were pissed at me for exerting my right. So it took a while to send me a new 6 month rent increase notice. And this time it's a rent increase of 17%. So they said they don't care anymore about the 9%. They're just gonna bump me up to 17%. So if I qualify for EDRA, I could move and get the EDRA notice. Oh yes, and by the way, with the 17% rent increase, they did include EDRA finally. But if I wanted to stay in this apartment, you can see that my rent has gone up more than before as a type of retaliation. And my income might be just a little bit too high because I got a check for back pay from the previous year because I was underpaid 2 years ago, which artificially inflated my year's earnings. So I might not qualify for EDRA, but I'm still planning to move because this overpriced roach building drives me nuts. So SDCI was unable to help me with the roach problem. They sent out an investigator and I showed him the sticky trap with dead roaches. And he said, but where are the live ones? I have to see live ones. And I said, I can't summon them on command. So he did nothing. But SDCI was much more helpful about the rent increase notices. So, and I think it may also depend on who you get on the phone or who you get on your feed. So if you're not getting a good result, you need to call back. And so here's my lessons learned. So also when I started this, I was terrified, but now I'm not afraid anymore. So do not immediately believe your landlord when they say you have to pay more or do something that you don't know about or that sounds fishy. Get a second or third opinion on anything your landlord says, because sometimes they just lie. And get everything in writing so you have proof of it. Know your rights, so you're doing good by being here, and be firm about demanding them. A lot of people back down because they're busy and their lives are stressful, and I get that, completely get it. But new laws come out all the time because of orgs like Be Seattle and volunteers and advocates like you. So please take advantage of these laws. Be a persistent caller with SDCI when you do have a case. I've memorized their violation line. It's 206-615-0808. I told it to all my neighbors in English and in Spanish. Ask lots of questions to SDCI when you get someone on your case. Like, what are the pros and cons of this action that you want to take? So they informed me that if I wanted to stay long-term in this exact apartment, the landlord could raise the rent as much as they want. But if I want to move, I can use EDRA. So you can see if this is a really great building and I want to stay, maybe I do need to take the 9% increase. And that kind of sucks. This process was very stressful. Sometimes I felt scared, angry, frustrated. I reached out to friends and a tenant rights group called Seattle Solidarity Network and got great emotional support and advice. But despite the negative feelings, seeing the law applied to a property management company that didn't care about the law was very satisfying. And it was kind of funny that after they failed one time to raise my rent, they also failed the second time. So that's my story. And I would really love to answer any questions, if there are any. I hope it's useful for someone, and I really hope you do call SDCI when there is a rent increase notice that you don't fully understand or you think might not be right. I have a friend in Capitol Hill who got on their rent increase notice. It said the Kirkland law for, I think, 120 days notice. And so I told them, you need to call SDCI right away. Here's the number. You're not in Kirkland. Seattle has a 180-day notice, and it has to have very specific words on the notice. Otherwise, your rent is staying the same. So it's okay to be sassy when someone's trying to take your money. That's my story.
Thank you so much, Carol. That was amazing. And thank you for laying it out, kind of your experience and everything that was going on. And it's good to hear from other people who have gone through this that, you know, it can be scary, but there's support out there, and there's that there are results out there.
Yeah, you have
Hopefully.
to be pretty persistent, and you have to get some emotional support telling you, no, you're right. You shouldn't have your rent increased in a nasty apartment with cockroaches. And I was scared because my landlord or the property manager actually lives directly below me. So I could, hear him getting mad sometimes, but that's, in the end, that's not my problem.
Exactly. Well, thank you again so much, Carol. We appreciate you for sharing that. After that empowering story, and we're going to move on to the second program we're going to talk about tonight, which is the Tenant Relocation Assistance Ordinance, also known as TREO. And the Tenant Relocation Assistance Ordinance was passed in 1990 and requires landlords to pay relocation money to tenants living on low incomes who are displaced from their units because of housing demolition, substantial rehabilitation, change of use, or removal of restrictions placed on subsidized housing. Tenants are entitled to 90 days notice before they have to vacate the unit for these purposes. Oops. So this is the income eligible households. It's 50% of household income maximum. And this is what it looks like for up to family household size of 8. And then we're going to look at a few types of specific instances within this program and this type of relocation help. So what if your building is being torn down or renovated? If housing is being torn down or renovated, if its use is being changed, or when certain restrictions on its use are removed, such as income limits, relocation assistance is paid to low-income tenants who have to move. Each low-income tenant household must be paid $4,232 in relocation assistance. And you have to have 50% of the median income to qualify. Half is paid by the city of Seattle and half is paid by the landlord or the property owner or developer. If the condominium conversion ordinance, which is basically, what if your building is being turned into a condo? We see that a lot around here. The property owner or developer must pay low-income tenants relocation assistance equal to 3 months of rent when housing is being converted into condos. Relocation assistance shall be paid to tenants who do not elect to purchase a unit in a conversion condo and who are tenants on the date of the condo conversion notice, and whose annual income from all sources on the date of the notice is 80% or less of the annual median income.
Hey, Tanya, I just
Hi.
wanted to note there's a couple things in the chat here that are relevant. Howard noted that there's a correction after landlords apply for TRAO and it is accepted. Tenants get a 90-day notice after that 90 days that they can.
Right, we talk about that in the timeline of the process.
And then there's one more thing, and it was that TRAO has now gone up to $5,323.
Okay, well, yeah, according to what we pulled from SDCI at the time, there, as of March, it still shows as 4. So we will get that corrected before we put anything out there. So condo conversion income restrictions. This is the median household incomes that are there. If you are elderly or special needs, there may be additional funds available to help with relocation. The ordinance does require some specific additions. So if your building is being converted to a co-op, the property owner must pay $500 in relocation assistance to a tenant when their housing is being changed into a cooperative. At least 120 days prior to offering any rental units or units for sale to the public as a co-op unit, tenants must receive notice of intention to sell. The notice shall specify the units to be sold and the sale price of each, and must also include a statement of tenants' rights as decided by SDCI. And then one more, what if your building is not allowed under the land use code? If this is the case, basically saying that that type of unit is not allowed in the zoning, a landlord must pay reallocation assistance to a tenant when the landlord must stop renting an illegal unit, no longer wants to rent an accessory dwelling unit, or must reduce the number of unrelated tenants living in a housing unit. A low-income tenant must be paid $2,000. A tenant who is not considered low income must be paid an amount equal to 2 months' rent. And then what if your unit is vacated and closed due to emergency conditions that is within the control of the landlord? If you must move because your housing unit is ordered vacated and closed, the property owner must pay you relocation assistance. The amount to be paid for low-income tenants is $4,022. And a tenant who is not low income must be paid an amount equal to 2 months of the rent. So timelines for the process. The owner in this situation applies for a tenant relocation license. And Howard, if I miss anything, let me know. Owner delivers packets within 30 days of the application to affected renters. Renters have 30 days from the date the packets are delivered to apply for relocation funds. After all applications for relocation funds have been reviewed, SDCI mails letters to the renters who have applied, informing them who is eligible. Both the owner and the tenant may appeal SDCI's eligibility decision. Are we on track, Howard? Okay. He knows these inside and out, so that's why I'm checking. Both the owner and the tenant may appeal SDCI's eligibility decision. The owner has 5 business days after receiving the notice of eligibility to pay their share. Once the owner has made full payment, they may issue the 90-day notice of development. Note, this is not a notice in the rental agreement. It means that the owner whoops, sorry. I can't read that word on my thing. But the notice will receive a license at the end of the 90 days. The license and at least one permit for the project allows the owner to end the rental agreement with appropriate advance written notice. So that is all of it. It is a lot. And Howard's going to talk on a little bit of ways to fight some of this, especially focused on rent evictions. But again, we have recorded this. It will be available. It's a lot of information. So next big thing, if you receive a notice, take a deep breath, make sure all the paperwork is with the notice, all the required wording is included, and make sure it was delivered properly and within the required timeframes. If you're not sure, you can reach out to us at B Seattle. You can reach out to SDCI. We are more than happy to help you with any of that. So next, there are a few ways to push back or delay relocation or rent eviction, or ideas on how to start working against this kind of displacement. And so now we're going to have Howard speak. Howard Gale is a research psychologist and lifelong activist currently involved in police accountability in Seattle. He's going to speak about all the ways that we can all come together to fight rent evictions in our buildings or in our homes. Excuse me. So Howard, it is all you.
Thanks, Tanya. Can you replace that picture of me with the let's see, 2 slides ago, the TRAO timeline? One more back. Yeah, good, perfect. Ah, no. One, yeah, that's it. Okay. So I just want to go back to something for a second, and that is, I think I've encountered this tension about the utility and usefulness of SDCI. I just want to say this. We all have our anecdotes, and anecdotes are great, but it's not going to bring us justice. I've been renting in Seattle now for 26 years. I've been living in the building I'm living in now for 18 plus years. Up until 2 years ago, it was managed by Cornell and Associates, which is a very large owner and manager of buildings. And I can tell you from experience, if I were to tell you I complained to SDCI 100 times about illegitimate notices of rent increases that didn't follow appropriate laws, even going back into the early 2000s, there was a 60-day requirement. I would not be exaggerating if I said 100 times. SDCI did nothing and in no way changed Cornell and Associates behavior, not just for my unit, not just in my building, but in hundreds of their buildings. So SDCI knows that this is an issue. It's great that in rare instances they might actually do something, but that is simply not, I would say that's just, it doesn't happen 95% of the time. So let's go to the TRAO. So you heard earlier about the EDRA. The advantage, so EDRA went into effect July 1st of last summer. The advantage of EDRA is it has the 80, you get the location assistance if you have 80% AMI. And the really important part of this is when your landlord gives you a 10% or greater increase, you then know you have 180 days in which you can decide, I'm going to pay that or move. That's a decision in your control with a time certain date. So I want to compare that to TRAO. Some of the information is on the screen now. It's an incredibly intimidating and confusing process. There are no time certain deadlines. I have studied the law now for months, and I have tenants in my building asking me, okay, I got a 90-day notice in January. What does that mean? After about 20 discussions with SDCI, the best I can tell them is I have no fucking idea. So, and this is important because the uncertainty which is built into the TRAO process allows landlords to scare tenants so that the vast majority of people in my building left before they even applied for relocation assistance, because they were confused as to whether it was going to happen in a month, a week. It was very confusing and intimidating. And that allowed the landlord to step in and say, we'll give you $500 if you move out right now, cash for keys, $1,000. And that scared a lot of people out of the building. So again, to make this very concrete, under a TRAO, the amount that the TRAO, the assistance has gone up. It's 50, whatever it is. I think $5,300 now, but the landlord only has to pay half of that, $2,600. So let's say you had an apartment that was $2,500 a month. Under EDRA, the landlord would have to hand you $7,500 if you were 80% or below AMI, $7,500. Under the TRAO, the landlord would only have to give you $2,600. That is a savings of like 66%. And would only have to give it to you if you were below 50% AMI. Now, this is a bit of a conundrum and a bit absurd. If you're below 50% AMI now in Seattle, what the fuck is the point of the location assistance? You will be locating outside of Seattle. If you're 50% AMI, not only is there no way that you will be able to afford a new rent in Seattle, nobody will rent with you. Most landlords now require proof of income where a 50% AMI would not allow you to rent in Seattle. So if the purpose of the TRAO, which was generated back in 1990, right? This is like more than 3 decades old. If the purpose was to help people relocate and limit the loss of people in Seattle. Clearly, that's not working. So, given that we don't have a lot of time, maybe what I'll skip to, if people have specific questions about this, I can answer it. But I think the timeline that's on the screen right now shows you there's a huge difference between me telling someone, hey, you got a rent increase. The day you got your rent increase, you have 180 days to accept that rent increase and continue living. That's your option. Or to take triple your rent and move. Whereas with the TRAO, it's just a horrible process, which, again, going back to SDCI, the sum total of SDCI over the last 6 months, 7 months, of their help for tenants in my building was to send one person for 2 hours on a Wednesday in the middle of the week from 11 to 1, when everyone is at work, to talk to them about the process in the presence of agents from the developer and landowner. That's how absurd. And when that one person who's assigned this, in my knowledge, up until January, there was only one person in SDCI that did all the TRAOs. That person was so overburdened, he never responded to phone calls, never responded to emails. And even though the law states they're supposed to notify tenants within, I think, 30 days of application, which would have been, I think, the end of December, very early January in my building. They failed to notify anyone until the very end of January. And when myself and other tenants called to say, we didn't even know if we were approved for relocation assistance. So anyway, it's a horrible process. And so let me just cut to the chase here and what my suggestions are for actions we can take. And I want to stress here, I think it's okay, certainly we should avail ourselves of whatever the legal resources are, but I think we also have to not wait for the city to take action or wait, for the SDCI to do things that it should do. So one of the things I did in my building is the first thing that's on your screen now: raise the cost of rent evictions by contacting Puget Sound Clean Air and the Washington State Labor and Industries. So to put things in context, these renovations are done on the sly and they're done on the cheap. And so they routinely violate worker protections, Puget Sound Clean Air protections for limiting mercury, lead, asbestos, and other hazardous substances. So that when landlords do this, it's not just that they're violating the rights and potentially displacing tenants, they're also violating community standards and injuring both workers and people in the neighborhood. In the case of my building, I live in a dense area in Lower Queen Anne, and numerous substances with lead and asbestos were simply placed out on the sidewalks to remain there for weeks and months at a time, dispersing toxic substances throughout the neighborhood. So this really is something that I think concerns everyone in the community, whether you're a renter or owner. So what I did is I contacted Puget Sound Clean Air and Labor and Industries, and they actually did shut down the work in my buildings for close to 4 months and levied a bunch of very serious fines. The second point would be direct action, actually organizing at other buildings that are owned by these developers, or even going to the developers' homes. And I think the principle there, I'm not a fan of protesting at people's homes, but in this case, you're going to ruin my quiet existence at home, I'll ruin yours. I mean, I think that's a totally fair principle. And then legal challenges. via individual lawsuits, class action, or mass action. And instead of going through the particulars of where I do think the legal challenges are, I'll say two things. Under class action, having a developer be able to increase its land value and profits by shifting half the cost of displacement onto the city taxpayer is outrageous. And so in that case, I think there's a cause of action that every single taxpayer in Seattle has. And that is, why is my tax money, why is hundreds of thousands of dollars going to help developers improve their bottom line and make money? And also displace tenants, but I'm actually paying for developers to make money. That doesn't make any sense. So I think there is a basis for a class action here. And then Tanya, could you go back to the slide for the TRAO? One more. Yeah, okay. And then the last thing is, if you notice at the very bottom of this list, it says the license. So under a TRAO for a renovation, I do want to say this. The law actually states, the wording in the law states substantial rehabilitation. So those are two important words, substantial rehabilitation. Rehabilitation by a legal, practical dictionary definition means you're bringing something back to purpose, back to its original intent. Putting in new kitchen cabinets and a new shower in the bathroom is not doing that. That is really a renovation. So I think there are two violations, prima facie violations that are going on here that SDCI is rubber stamping. One, a substantial rehabilitation is not a cosmetic improvement. And the very last item, the license and at least one permit for the project allows the owner to end the rental agreement with appropriate advance written notice. There's a requirement in the TRAO for the developer to apply for the TRAO, and then at or just after the time that it's approved, they apply for the proper licenses with SDCI for doing the renovation. In the case of my building, they applied for those licenses over 1 year before the TRAO. That is a gross violation. The fact that SDCI didn't catch that and didn't enforce that is egregious. Now, again, in case this is getting too much in the weeds, just let me say this. The rationale for that is if you're applying for simple licenses to do work in buildings, and then the light bulb goes off in the developer's head, oh, I should apply for the TRAO, kick everyone out, and then I can just increase rents whatever I want, whenever I want. That's why there's a process that says, no, you've thought long and hard about rehabilitating this building, and so you're going to ask for permission to do it, and then you're going to kick everyone out. That is the logical flow of permits. In my building, the exact reverse was done. And it begs the question, in my building, when people typically just move out, when an apartment normally turns over, we have very nice hardwood floors. Every time a tenant leaves, there's major work done on the hardwood floors, refinishing them. The shower surrounds, which get grody and moldy, get ripped out and put in. That's not completely trivial work. And sometimes there is new flooring put down in the kitchen and bathrooms and cabinets. So that's normal work that's done when an apartment turns over. It begs the question, the work that's being done in my building is pretty much just that. It's work that could be done when a tenant normally leaves. It's not improving the health and safety. It's not returning the function of the apartments or the buildings to something that existed in the past or to some higher level. Again, I think that's a third basis for questioning this whole process. That's it. Any questions?
I just want to note for the folks in the room, and if you're watching the recording, that we have a work group that we work with Howard and a couple other renters to try to tackle this issue. Howard pointed out like several different angles that we can take. So if this is something that interests you, email me, kate@bseattle.org, and we can let you into the work group. We meet Mondays at 1 o'clock.
And I would just add one other little point, while if people are thinking of questions. Again, I realize there's a tension here, but I want to be really clear. You know, one of the people that's supposed to be working, for tenants in SDCI, when I asked about the basis for them rubber stamping the TRAO in my building, which is 48 units, 48 families. And in recent years, it's become one of the more affordable buildings on the edge of downtown and has a lot of people that are Southeast Asian and Latinx, which also made it easier for the developer to scare people out of the building. When I asked SDCI, and I'll tell you, the person's name was Maureen wrote, if there's an appeals process and why they rubber stamped it, instead of simply saying, that's what we do and we enjoy doing it, or no, there's no appeals process, I was sent an email justifying why the TRAO was necessary, with facts that were 100% incorrect. I was faced with an SDCI employee providing the rationales given by my developer, Cadence Properties, which were 100% false. So, for example, just one clear example, I was told in the email by Maureen wrote that major electrical work had to be done in my building for hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's true. Major electrical work was done in my building. It has been completed. It's been completed before anyone left. It was work that did not have to be done. It was done for reasons that I don't understand. It did cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, but it was work that was done way before. And so one last point I'll make here, I don't even see the financial benefit, given that there is no rent control and that landlords can charge whatever rent they want, given they do have to spend $7,500 or whatever. They have to spend triple the rent and give people 180-day notice. It's not clear to me why my developer landlord is going through such a burdensome process that's costing millions of dollars in a building that's probably only worth $4 or $5 million. I mean, only, but whatever. And the only insight I have, which makes this process all the more horrendous, is that they're doing this to capitalize on the value of the property in order to float loans for other properties. That this is basically a pyramid scheme. It's similar to what Donald Trump did in New York. And that it just doesn't pencil out that they're doing these renovations simply to increase rent. I think they're doing this, and that's the horrible part, is they're doing this not just to increase their bottom line, but to increase their purchase of other buildings in Seattle, and do the same thing. So.
I also feel like I just wanted to point out, Howard, you kind of went quickly through the direct action that you took, but by reporting them, Howard got that job site shut down for 5 weeks in addition to all those fines. That's pretty impressive direct action that one person.
5 months.
5 months?
Yes.
That is awesome.
So that's just an option that doesn't go through SDCI if you don't get the answer that you want. There are other ways to approach this, and I really wanted to highlight that part because I was like, that's so badass. Does anyone else have any questions for Howard or for Carol? Oh, Kimberly, I see your hand is up.
Hey, yeah, can you hear me? My audio's been a little funny. Okay. I'm actually just wondering, Howard, if you're willing to just re-explain, and if this is taking up too much space, then that's fine, but just re-explain like why developers or landlords are doing this to increase their purchase of other buildings in Seattle, or how specifically going through the TRAO equates to that.
Oh, okay. So
Like, it's not just about them increasing their bottom line or like the building, but it's about their ability to then purchase other buildings. Is that
right. Oh, okay. So when my landlord bought this building that was managed by Cornell and Associates in December of 2021, that was their plan from the beginning, is to let people just stay here, and do the old-fashioned form of renoviction, which is create so much disorder, detritus, toxic fumes, and noise that people would self-evict. So let's separate two things. The plan from the beginning, when they bought this building, literally day one, was to make trivial renovations, and increase rents, which they could do anyway. And I think what that does is that, again, similar to Donald Trump, with these new renovations, they can claim that the building is worth double what they paid for. And so then when they want to buy the next building, they can put that up as collateral. Again, this is exactly what Donald Trump did in New York. So I think that's the economic game plan. Cadence Realty Peak Living Properties started right during the housing crash in 2008, by two frat bros in Bellevue, just out of college, who decided to start buying up undervalued property. And so they've been doing this for 15 years now, pretty much only in Seattle, and this seems to be an MO. So each individual building that they buy up is turned into its own LLC. I have tracked down now 123 LLCs owned by these two guys. And so again, I'm not a financial expert. Someone smarter than me is going to have to weigh in on this, but it's the only thing that makes sense as to why they would buy my building, and invest $200,000, just in replacing the electric panel in the basement. So that's one part of it. Now, I think the second part of what you're asking is, that was their plan, was just to force people out. The few holdovers, they would just jack their rent up, only have to give them a few months notice, no big deal. July of last year, 2022, the EDGR went into effect, and I think that's what made the light go off in their head and everyone else's, all other developers, that this is now getting to be too costly. Let's just get a TRAO and evict everyone. And also, people were not moving out. So I think these are two separate issues. Let me, again, not to bore people, with SDCI's incompetence. When my building was bought in December 2021, in January and February of 2022, during one of the coldest winters, they decided to replace the electric. And in the middle, you can't make this up, in the middle of February, when the temperatures dropped to 12, 13 degrees in Seattle, they decided to tell people they were going to turn off all electricity to the buildings, which meant no heat, no light, no hot water, nothing, for what was going to be 12 hours and ended up in some cases being 72 hours. When I called SDCI about this, they said, call us when it happens. And I said, and what are you going to do about it when it happens? They said, we'll tell them to turn the electricity back on. I said, well, of course they'll turn the electricity back on. Where are people supposed to live for the 24 to 48 hours when it's 12 degrees out? And they basically said, not our problem. So my building is actually two buildings across the street from each other. They did this in one building. I called SDCI and said they're doing it. In 7 days, they're going to do it to our building. And SDCI told me, do you live in that other building? And I said, no. And they said, we don't want to hear about it. So again, there's beyond the TRAOs and EDRA nonsense and all that other stuff, even without this stuff, renovictions has been something that's been going on for decades. And again, turning off the electricity in the middle of winter when they easily could have done it in summer, and they easily could have done it in phases that wouldn't have necessitated, you know, the shock and abuse to people. This was purely intentional. And it was their first signal after buying the building. Hey, you want to live here? You don't want to self-evict? This is what you're going to have to, you know, endure. So
I think it's also important to mention, just for transparency, that B Seattle has received funds, continues to receive funds from SDCI for these workshops specifically, to educate tenants about their rights. But they didn't make us sign a contract stating that we agree with all of their methods, and there are some things that really need to be changed. They're kind of, I mean, the people themselves are not like robots, but the way the department offers or works is kind of robotic in that if it's technically like within the law, and they don't try to interpret the law different ways. Like once they've decided, and it's almost always towards the landlord's advantage, that is how it is. So with Howard saying, you know, they're going to turn off the electricity, they don't have an internal way to respond to that until it has happened, and it has to be reported by a tenant within the building. It doesn't always work, and there are other things that we should do as organizers, and we're running out of time. But certainly that is something that we at B Seattle want to change. And so I just wanted to clarify that if anyone is watching this in the future. We've had a lot of good experiences with SDCI when it comes to code compliance. And that's really kind of where they shine, because that's a very like simple thing, but the new tenant protections and things that can be interpreted differently, they take a morally neutral stance, but being morally neutral generally harms the person with less power, which is always the tenant.
yeah, I was going to say, I'm going to type this into the chat, that there are 3 things at a minimum they could have done with their code enforcement ability, or 4 things actually. One, they could have asked for some kind of validation or proof that the work needed to take more than 72 hours. They simply took the developer's landlord's word for that. 2, they could have asked, why are these any different from the kinds of renovations they might make when an apartment turns over? And then 3, the director of SDCI, under the code 22.210 that provides for the TRAO, under that code, it specifically says the director has the ability, you know, to impose refinements and conditions. And I think one very logical one would have been for the director of SDCI to say, there's a rash of these happening now that EDRA went into effect. There's literally hundreds of people that will be displaced. You know, I feel we have to tighten up the restrictions around the 72-hour need to leave the apartment, and et cetera. So anyway, I think there's lots of things SDCI could have done, and they, I would argue, actively, not passively, but actively chose not to do that.
I mean, I would argue otherwise, but I think ultimately it doesn't really matter what their intention is, because the outcome is the same. So like I said, we have a work group. Please consider joining. We're pretty small right now, but we take all of these like moving pieces that Howard's discussing and try to find solutions both inside and outside of SDCI. So with that, I want to check one more time. Are there any questions for Howard or Carol? We didn't really do a Q&A too much with Carol. Okay, Tanya, could you hop to the next slide? We have an action to take, unrelated to rent evictions, but still important. We like to include an action that renters can take immediately at every workshop. Did you know that buildings are one of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in our city? With a Green New Deal plan to move big buildings off of fossil fuels by 2030, we can create a more sustainable and equitable future for all. As renters, this plan will directly impact our lives. Moving big buildings off fossil fuels will improve air quality, creating a healthier living environment for us and our families. Additionally, the plan prioritizes investment in energy efficient and affordable housing, which means we'll have access to housing that is designed to be more resilient to the impacts of climate change. So let's show our city leaders that we demand action on climate change and are willing to take steps to achieve our goals. 350 Seattle, Unite Here Local 8, and Sierra Club of Washington State have created a form where you can send a letter to the Seattle City Council, Seattle City leaders. It goes to the mayor's office and a couple other people, expressing your support for the Green New Deal plan and urging them to take action. Your voice matters, and together we can create a more livable future for Seattle renters.
Can you drop that that link in the chat, because the one on the screen is not clickable?
Yes,
Yes,
it's in the
Thank
chat
you.
now.
I'll
Okay,
put it one more time. So it's there a second time.
I see it. Thank you.
Yeah, we just have it on the screen so folks in the future can get it later. But for those of us here in the room, we've got it clickable right now.
Thank you.
So it's 7:48. Oh, Tanya has made the decision. This workshop is done. Thank you all so much for coming. Especially thank you to Ty, who had to leave, Carol and Howard. You were great, and this really helped shine a light on the various tactics that can be used to fight displacement, and the gaps in our system, which are huge. But we as renters can fight back against them. So thank you all so much for coming.
And thank you all for bearing with us with some of our weird tech issues tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.